Hey everyone, today we're going to be reviewing the 20mm f1.8 lens from Sony. I've been waiting for this lens to come out for a while. I feel like it's a hole that's been missing in the Sony lineup, and I'm excited to have this one to try out. We're going to be talking about how this lens compares to some of the alternatives out there, specifically the Tokina 20mm f2 lens, and also I'll briefly mention the 24mm f1.4 lens from Sony. I've owned the tokina lens for almost 2 years now. Bought this right after it came out in April of 2018 because I wanted a 20mm fast prime lens for Sony full frame E-mount, and I also wanted the autofocus version. There was a manual focus version of this lens out previously, but the autofocus was essential because I use it for a variety of things. But now that the 20mm f1.8 from Sony is out, it is definitely going to be a decision whether or not to sell this lens and upgrade to this one. The main reason I have a 20mm prime lens is for two things: astrophotography, or anything landscape in low light, and also for a backup for my 16 to 35mm f2.8 from Sony. That G Master zoom lens is one of my main lenses that I use, and I like to have a similar focal length backup lens for it just in case I drop it while I'm out on a shoot and I need to fill that focal range. So the 20mm focal length is, in my opinion, it's really good for two things. As I mentioned, astrophotography and landscape photography. So getting that wide perspective that captures the whole scene and really draws the eye into that full wide view. In terms of astrophotography, the prime is essential because it is sharper and usually faster, so it has a lower minimum aperture than a zoom lens. So having the f2 in this case, or the Sony f1.8, allows you to just capture a ton of light and not have to crank up your ISO so high when you're shooting those nighttime photos. When it comes to a walk-around lens, I feel like the 20mm is a little bit wide in terms of just like shooting everyday subjects. It's usually too wide for a portrait because it just has a little bit too much distortion. And despite the fact that the distortion is well controlled on this lens, it just, based on that wide focal length, it kind of tends to make things look slightly unnatural. And it's especially exaggerated if you tilt your lens upward. You're going to get kind of warped edges, and buildings are no longer going to look straight. So if you're hoping to shoot any kind of real estate or architectural photography, one tip is to just try to keep your lens as level as possible and not tilt it up or down, because that tends to just cause things to look a little warped. The 20mm f1.8 is also an awesome lens for aerial photography, where you're shooting down from an aircraft and you're trying to capture the landscape, but usually you want to keep your shutter speed really high because of the vibration of the aircraft. So if you're trying to keep your shutter speed up around 1,000 or even higher, it helps to have that really low aperture so you don't have to crank up your ISO, similar to when you're shooting astrophotography. You're just trying to keep your ISO down and keep the noise level in the sensor down. And then lastly, my favorite thing about having a prime lens is just it forces you to zoom with your feet and be a little more proactive when you're creating images. You can't just sit there and zoom in on the zoom ring to change your perspective. You actually have to walk around, move around, and I feel like that just causes you to create better compositions. We'll get into some of the detailed features here in a second, but the other fun feature about having a prime lens is just the simplicity of it. You don't have to think about anything. It's just one focal length, and that's all you have. So now that we've covered kind of generally what I think this lens is for and why I like it, let's talk about some of the specifics. So this lens is 13 ounces, which is roughly 3 ounces lighter than the Tokina. And it's also slightly larger, but because it's lighter weight, it still kind of feels smaller in terms of how it balances on the camera. When it comes to cost, this lens is coming in around $900. This one's around $850. So pretty similar there. The one thing to consider is that if you're going to be having this lens for a while, the native Sony lenses will tend to hold their value better. So having an off-brand like a Tokina or a Sigma just long-term doesn't hold quite as much value. When it comes to the ergonomics and handling, these lenses are pretty similar. I like the rubberized grip on the Sony. This is an all-metal exterior here on the Tokina. But the one thing that I noticed, this thing comes with a manual aperture ring, and I found that a lot of times when I was mounting the lens, I would accidentally bump it into a manual aperture control. And then I am shooting photos and I am changing my aperture with the dial, and I can't figure out what's going on, and I realize that I'm no longer in the automatic mode on the aperture dial, which allows you to change your aperture via the camera dial instead of using this. This is a cool feature though for people that haven't had the experience to work with older lenses prior to everything being automatic. You actually had to dial in your aperture, so it kind of has an analog feel to it that can be kind of fun, especially if you are teaching someone new. It's very easy to see and it's very simple. Just dial it right in and you can manually adjust the aperture. Other features on the lenses, this lens from Sony has an autofocus, manual focus switch. This one does not. This is super handy if you're shooting video or if you're shooting a time lapse and you don't want your autofocus to be bouncing around while you're trying to create a static shot. It also has the focus hold button, which is handy. It can be programmed to back button focus, or I guess in this case front button focus, or you can also program it to activate the eye autofocus function on the Sony cameras, which is really handy. Lastly, you'll find the D-click switch for the aperture, which is great for video shooters. It allows you to adjust your aperture and therefore your exposure silently without making any clicking sounds. I don't know if you can hear that, but when you de-click it, it's completely silent. I didn't find this to be hugely advantageous. Most of the time I'm shooting in the automatic mode and switching my aperture with the dial, but I guess if you did find yourself shooting video more often and adjusting your exposure in that way, you would find that feature helpful. In terms of ergonomics, this lens just feels great. I like the way it balances, and I like the feel of the grip on the focus ring and this aperture ring. It just feels really good in the hand. And I also like that it's lighter weight than this Tokina version, and just this is a really easy combination to hand hold and not feel like your hand is or your wrist is going to get tired. When it comes to focus performance, this lens, I would say it outperforms the Tokina just slightly, and the autofocus on both of them is really fast. I never have any issues missing focus. But the one thing I did notice when I was out shooting star photos is that this manual focus ring, when you set your camera to manual focus, it just felt a little bit more controlled in terms of that linear actuation, so that when you rotate the dial at a consistent pace, it focuses at a consistent pace, which helps you dial in that infinity focus point for your stars to be sharp. In terms of light transmission, this is an f2 lens versus the f1.8 from Sony, so slightly faster here, and I did notice that in the files. It seemed like there was just a slightly brighter image when I was shooting same camera, same lens, just back and forth comparing the two. The Sony was just slightly brighter, which just helps you keep that ISO down and get more light when you're shooting in really dark environments. Overall, this is a fantastic lens. Really excited that Sony finally filled their 20mm hole in their lineup with a nice prime lens. And I think, if you're comparing these two or the 24mm, in terms of astrophotography, the 20mm from Sony is definitely a step above the other options. At a similar price point, I'd definitely opt for the Sony. And when compared with the 24mm f1.4, yeah, this lens is not a G Master lens, and it is not f1.4, it's f1.8, but that extra savings of you get a wider perspective with 20mm than you do with 24, and I really appreciate that when you're trying to create an astro composition. Having a little bit wider perspective allows you to get some foreground while still capturing the Milky Way at the top of the frame, whereas 24 millimeters, it feels a little bit more restrictive in terms of being able to capture some of the foreground and whatever your subject is, as well as having the Milky Way above it. So now we're going to jump into Lightroom and take a look at some comparison and see how the Tokina compares to the Sony. On the left side here, you'll see the Sony lens at f1.8, and on the right, you'll see the Tokina lens at f2. I'm not sure, well, this isn't a very scientific comparison, but the light transmission of these two lenses appears to be very similar. The next thing I was going to look at is the sharpness. So when we zoom into 100% crop here, you can see that the Sony lens is quite a bit sharper on the edges of the frame. I could have missed the focus slightly on the Tokina in these images, but when you look towards the center of the frame, the sharpness appears to be pretty similar. So I think that overall, the Sony lens is much sharper around the edges. When it comes to chromatic aberration, I didn't see much color shift. Both these lenses appear to be really well controlled when it comes to chromatic aberrations. And the pinpoint stars in the corners, you'll see that they're both pretty close to dots, which is what they should look like, instead of ovals or distorted shapes. Both these lenses are excellent quality, as you can see from the images here, but I think the Sony stands out as just slightly sharper. Now that we looked at a side-by-side comparison of these two lenses, I'd like to show you some sample images and give you a feel for what you can expect in terms of performance from the Sony 20mm f1.8. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this review of the 20mm f1.8 from Sony helpful. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. I'd love to know your thoughts on if you'll be upgrading to this lens or adding it to your lineup, and what info you haven't seen covered in reviews and would like to know more about. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our channel to get more content like this. Thanks so much.